Everyone, and pray and hope that everyone is safe and healthy on this Wednesday evening, and of course also your families, your loved ones, and people that you know are safe and healthy as well. And welcome to the NABJ webinar. This is the U.S. Capitol Insurrection and Journalism. Basically, where do we go from here? Today we have distinguished panelists, and we'll be talking about what happens from here on out. Hundreds of arrests have been made with regard to the United States Capitol insurrection that happened on January 6th. And we'll be talking about all the repercussions that happen from here, including charges that have been mounted, how the federal justice system works, understanding the court structure, and also, of course, reporter, journalist do's and don'ts when it comes to covering stories, when it comes to arrests that are made regarding the U.S. Capitol insurrection. My name is Andrew Humphrey. I'm a meteorologist and reporter at WDIV in Detroit, Michigan. Also an NABJ member, a lifetime member, in fact, past president of the Detroit chapter of NABJ, founder also of the Digital Journalism Task Force, and it's wonderful that everyone else is here online with us. So let me get right into it because we only have an hour to talk, and I have a feeling that there is going to be a lot to talk about. Let me go ahead and run down the panelists that we have with us this evening. I'll go in alphabetical order by last name. Many of you may have seen, whether it's at an NABJ convention or through NABJ or on television or elsewhere, especially regarding this topic. First up, Assistant Dean for Programs and Chair at the Department of Multimedia Journalism at Morgan State University. Everyone, please welcome Jackie Jones. A little bit about her. Jackie Jones, once again, is Assistant Dean for Programs and Chair of the Department of Multimedia Journalism in the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University. As chair, Dean Jones oversees the development of the department's digital newsroom as the Center for Student Training and Immersion, reporting opportunities on multiple stages, from the coverage of disturbances in Baltimore in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray, to the Maryland election coverage and reporting also from Cuba and Greece. She is also a veteran newswoman and has worked in a variety of cities and newsrooms, including places like the Detroit Free Press, New York Newsday, Philadelphia Daily News, to just name a few. Welcome, Jackie. Good to see you here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, Barbara McQuade. She is professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School. Professor McQuade is a professor from practice. Her interests include criminal law, criminal procedure, national security, data privacy, and civil rights. Now, from 2010 to 2017, Professor McQuade served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. She was appointed by President Barack Obama. When she was appointed to that position of the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, she was the first woman to serve in that position. Professor McQuade also served as the Vice Chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee and co-chaired its Terrorism and National Security Subcommittee. As U.S. Attorney, she oversaw cases involving public corruption, terrorism, corporate fraud, theft of trade secrets, civil rights, and healthcare fraud, among many others. Professor McQuade also serves as a legal analyst, and you may have seen her on NBC News and also MSNBC, and her work has also appeared in a number of publications, including the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Just Security, Slate, and National Public Radio. Professor Barbara McQuade, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Next up, last but not least, Mr. Jeff Pegues. Jeff Pegues is CBS News Chief Justice and Homeland Security Correspondent based in Washington, D.C. He joined CBS News in July of 2013 and reports for all CBS News broadcast platforms, including CBS This Morning and CBS Evening News. Since joining CBS News, Mr. Pegues has led the network's coverage in some of the biggest stories of the last decade. Mr. Pegues has also become one of the preeminent journalists on the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, and he's also an author. His latest book, Compromat: How Russia Undermined American Democracy, is one of his books. Mr. Pegues has more than 2 decades worth of reporting experience that includes various presidential elections, national disasters, active shooter events, and terrorist attacks. In addition to his national work, he's also served at many local shops, including WABC in New York and WBAL in Baltimore. Mr. Pegues, thank you very much for joining us this evening as well. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. If you don't mind, Barbara, I'll go ahead and start with you. Like I said before, hundreds of arrests have been made, and many of these arrests are public information. They can easily be seen online, including on the FBI's website. And there are a number of charges that have been filed. What are the types of charges that have been filed so far, and what do they mean?
Yes, and thank you, Andrew. I want to say thank you for the invitation to be here with you, and wonderful to be with these co-panelists, and really happy to be able to share information with journalists. The work that you're doing is incredibly important to American democracy. So thank you for the important work you do. Some of the charges that we've seen so far, you mentioned there have been more than 300 people charged and more than 280 arrested. So that means some have been charged and not yet arrested, but a variety of charges. And I would divide them maybe into a few different categories. One, at the lowest level, are people who simply entered a restricted area or engaged in disorderly conduct. Some of those things can be misdemeanor offenses. So there are some of those. And then the next category are people who assaulted police officers or engaged in property damage, or what they call violent entry. And so those are felony offenses. And then the most serious charge we've seen to date are charges of conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. And I tip my hat to the prosecutors who came up with that charge, because I think I've been waiting for a charge of seditious conspiracy, which we may still see, but that can be very challenging to prove. The elements of that require some proof of intent that can be challenging, but they went for something that's a little easier to prove, which is a conspiracy to interfere with an official proceeding. So the vote count, if their goal was simply to stop or delay that vote count, that can be proven. And they've been charged based on things that they said in social media or text messages to each other about how that was their goal. And so, as a tip for journalists who want to learn more about this, looking at the complaint documents that get filed can be really valuable, because the agents and the prosecutors will include a detailed narrative about what has happened in those cases. And a fairly new phenomenon, at least in the past 5 to 10 years, is frequently prosecutors will paste in photos that help bolster their case. Here's something I got on social media with a picture of the suspect right there in the Capitol. The other great document to look for to learn about things that we're learning from is detention motions and the briefs that prosecutors are filing, because those tend to go beyond the scope of the charges and talk about some of the things the person did that makes them a danger to the community and why the prosecutor is opposing bond.
I want to follow up with that, but first I do want to mention, for everyone that's watching and listening, remember, use the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. We're going to talk, we're all going to have a conversation as panelists and me as the moderator here until about 15 minutes before 8:30, and at that time we'll get into question and answer. Once again, the Q&A portion of Zoom, not the chat. And Barbara, to follow up with that, with what you answered, it's interesting that you said that some of these charges may be misdemeanors and some of them are felonies. Just basic law 101 here. One might think, since the crime was so serious, everything was so dramatic and really so historic on January 6th, all right, one might assume that any of the charges would be felonies, especially if they're on the grounds of the US Capitol or federal authorities are bringing these charges. So what's the difference between a felony with these charges, misdemeanor, and what does it mean for those who are arrested?
Mm-hmm. So a prosecutor, can't simply say that a person engaged in bad behavior. They have to choose a charge that exists in the statute books, and they have to find a charge that fits the conduct. And so typically a misdemeanor, under federal law at least, is a crime that is punishable by up to 1 year. And felonies will be punishable by more than a year. And each statute will have its own type of punishment. And some have a a version that's a misdemeanor and a version that's a felony. For example, property damage or theft of government property. So we know there's been allegation of someone stealing a laptop, for example, out of Nancy Pelosi's office. The value of that laptop will determine whether it's below or a felony or a misdemeanor. $1,000 is the cutoff. So if it's more than $1,000, it's a felony. If it's less than $1,000, it's a misdemeanor. And I hear what you're saying, that how can anybody who was there that day be charged with something that's called a misdemeanor? But if the only charge is that they walked in the door, the only charge you really have available for using in that instance is this entering a restricted area, which is a misdemeanor. Now, I also will say this: frequently, a prosecutor will charge the lowest, easiest to prove charge initially, just to get their hands on the person, to get them into court, because then you can explore some options. Number one, is the person dangerous, in which case they should be detained? That's an important determination. Is the person competent to stand trial? Do they have mental issues that make them a danger to themselves or others, or that they're not able to be prosecuted for a crime? And then once they do have their hands on them, they can continue to investigate the case, which may take some time, to look at social media, to look at text messages, to get a search warrant for their phone and look at the contents. And it could be that although their initial charge was entering a restricted area, they're able to develop evidence of something far more serious, and then charge them with that in a superseding document.
Okay, and some Law 101 here, just the basics here. What is the basic flow chart or structure of the court system with people who are arrested? These arrests are made all over the country, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But what are some of the basics? What, in terms of the court structure and the flow chart of that, what can they expect?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, Andrew, and I cheated because he gave me a heads up that he would. May I share my screen with the group? I have a little flow chart, if I could share that.
Yeah.
Do I have the capability to do that? All right, I'll give it a try.
Do you see share screen at the bottom of your screen in the center?
I do. I do. So let me take a shot at that. Are you able to see that chart?
Yes.
The wonders of technology. Isn't that amazing? This is the way the courts are structured all over the country. So on the right side, you'll see state courts, the state court system. And wherever you live, it'll have its own kind of funky naming convention. You know, here in Michigan, we have district courts and then circuit courts and courts of appeals and the state Supreme Court. But these cases have all been charged in federal court. So that's the left side of things. So we have the district courts, which are the trial courts, kind of the lowest level. And then we have courts of appeals. Here in Michigan, we go to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. In Washington, they go to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And then those cases go up to the US Supreme Court, which can hear cases coming out of either the federal or the state system. What you might have heard that can sometimes cause confusion is magistrate judges. Well, what's a magistrate judge? We read about them all the time. And so magistrate judges are part of the district court. They are judges who are not selected by the president, as all these other judges are in the federal system. They're actually selected by the judges themselves. They're a fairly new creature. They were created in the 1970s. And the idea was judges have an awful lot on their plate. And many of the tasks that they do are kind of perfunctory and could be done if they could be delegated to someone else. And district court judges could focus on the big things like conducting trials and writing legal opinions. Then magistrate judges could do things like initial appearances and arraignments and detention hearings and those kinds of things. And not to say the work is unimportant. They also decide whether search warrants should be granted, make decisions on whether somebody gets bail or is detained pending trial. And so typically when someone is arrested, the first judge they will see is a magistrate judge who will advise them of what they've been charged with and also conduct that initial detention hearing as to whether this person should be held pending trial or released. And because this crime occurred in Washington, D.C., but then everybody went home to their home states, many of these people have been arrested in their home states by the FBI locally, brought to their local U.S. district court. And then that judge will make this decision on detention or not. And then they'll issue an order to transfer the case to Washington where it's been charged. And so typically you'll see that. And at some point, these defendants will show up in Washington, D.C. It may be via Zoom for further proceedings in that court.
Okay, and we'll talk about the logistics of that in a second, but I do want to get to our other panelists here. Jackie, given what we've talked about so far, including charges that are pending and the sort of flow chart of the court system so far, what are some of the basics journalists should do when it comes to developing sources and then reaching out to them to find out more about arrests that either have been made or may potentially be made and what's expected for them next?
Well, in most newsrooms, you're going to have people who are assigned to cover those beats. So you're going to have courts reporters, you're going to have people who cover national agencies, federal agencies, that kind of thing. So those folks pretty much know the structure. When we bring in others reporters to work with them, usually they are doing sort of, ancillary stuff, trying to find some sources who know a little bit about what's going on somewhere. So I would say, for example, they may want to spend some time looking at the staffs of relevant House and Senate committees that are going to be investigating what happened, and talk to the staff level people. You may need the congressman or the senator for a soundbite to get them on screen, but the people who actually do the work, do the research, put together the talking points are the staff people, and they usually are willing to talk to you. And they are also the gatekeepers to a certain degree to whether you're going to get access to their bosses or not.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Now, Jeff, again, from the list I've seen so far of the arrests that have been made, the only state I have not seen where there's been an arrest, unless it's changed within the past 24 hours, is the state of Alaska. Even the state of Hawaii has at least one arrest. So that means there have been arrests in Montana, in Mississippi, in California, in Wyoming, in these smaller markets where many of our audience members may actually be. And for a young new reporter, which I'm sure you were one day, not too many years ago, I might add, I'm sure, following up on how to build sources, or also who are the best people to contact within law enforcement? Say you are in a smaller city like whether it's Jackson, Mississippi or Jackson, Wyoming. Because if I'm not mistaken, Barbara, many of these federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI or ATF, they're working in conjunction with local law enforcement, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So what should these reporters keep in mind when it comes to staying in touch with local law enforcement when it comes to some of these raids and or arrests?
You know what? The best thing to do is, if you're in those communities, if you've been in those communities, get to know the chief of police. Why not? He's not untouchable, and in many cases, they want information to get out there. In fact, today, we're preparing for tomorrow, which some extremists view as the true inauguration day. And so law enforcement has been leaking out intelligence bulletins warning of that date on the calendar, March 4th, warning that extremists are intent on causing trouble. And so my point is, there are a lot of times, and as a young reporter, you might not realize this, but it benefits law enforcement to get some of this information out. It is important to, and especially what we've seen over the last couple of months, they want to scare these people. They do not want them coming to Washington, D.C. So the more you can get that message out that they are ready for these extremists. You have the National Guard here, you have Capitol Police, you have the FBI, you have Metro PD, DC Police. The more that they can get that message out, the better off it is for them. And to get their message out, they're going to need reporters. They're going to need to leak some of this information so that it gets out to the public. And so if you're a young reporter, go the extra mile, develop relationships, business relationships with these law enforcement types. I tell a lot of people that in some cases, it's like being in sales, in that, the more people that you have in your Rolodex, the better off your job security is, frankly. It's having a certain amount of influence in your newsroom, especially if the news director is looking around for information and you say, hey, I got a source I can call. That's really impressive, because most people don't, frankly. They don't have those relationships. And if you build those relationships, it's really currency.
And really, this might be a first for many journalists, especially if they're in a medium-sized or smaller-sized market. And I'm not just talking about television. We're also talking about print. We're also talking about radio. We're also talking about the web as well. Can it be, for someone who works in a smaller town, especially if they're on the job for, say, 5 years or less, can it be rather daunting to basically cover something that's on a global scale, or something, or an event that follows from something that is as big as the insurrection. Can that mean added pressure and added nervousness when it comes to covering news like this?
Sure, I still get butterflies. It's like game day. If you're an athlete, you're gonna have those butterflies until that first word comes out of your mouth, and then everything sort of settles down. But it's okay to be a little nervous. But you have to look at it as, if you are ambitious, if you want people to see your work, this is an opportunity for people to see what you're doing. And this is really what you train for, are the big stories. And so if you're a young reporter, no matter where you are, this is how you demonstrate the skill set that you have. And we're all in this business, not only because we love it, but we got to pay the bills too. And so the more you can demonstrate your skills as a journalist, the better off you're going to be.
I think
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
You got to do your homework. As Jeff was saying, that you've got all these different jurisdictions. Well, you got to know the difference. If I was talking to somebody shortly after the insurrection, and they said, well, there are more law enforcement people per capita in the district than anywhere, and I don't understand why it was so uncoordinated, and why didn't DC police do more? And I said, because the MPD can't just walk onto Capitol property. That's federal property. You need to know what the lines are, what the jurisdiction lines are, what's the reporting scheme. The more of that kind of stuff the better. And that's the kind of thing that you can read up on and find and research and know, so that when you always tell a young journalist, don't ask people questions that you can find out yourself by looking it up. What you want to do is to get to the meat of the story and get to move it forward, because you're only going to get so much time with people. They got things to do. So you don't want to get them to start from the beginning like a fairy tale. You've got to be ready to give them some real questions to show that you know what you're talking about. And once they know that you understand what's going on, they're going to be a little straighter with you.
In addition to go ahead, Jeff, if you have something to add.
Well, I think Jackie brings up, very good points. And I've covered law enforcement for close to 30 years across the country. I've covered this beat for the network for about 8 years, but I love Barbara's presentation. I just, the chart was great. It is always good to look at this judicial system that we have and see the different aspects of it. It can be complicated. It can be daunting. But it's also really interesting how law enforcement and the legal system work together in this country, and how there are failings and gaps in the system. And, we're seeing some of that at play now when you see some of this testimony on Capitol Hill as it relates to the failures on January 6th. Well, why couldn't MPD call in the National Guard? Was it the president's job to do that? Or was it the Speaker of the House who should have done more in terms of the preparation of the Capitol police force? And so there are a lot of interesting questions related to this story.
And as you both mentioned, Jackie and Jeff, it can be complex in doing your story research. What are the best practices you either teach or you've actually been able to put into practice in taking all of that information, everything that you've researched from all the interviews and from all the people that you've talked with, and narrowing that down into a presentation for the audience to easily understand, whether it's on television or if you're given so many words in a newspaper?
Well, you got to look at what's been reported already to make sure that you're not being redundant. You also have to think about what's advancing the story, but you've got to make sure you're backgrounding yourself. If you're not paying attention, you should be watching the hearings. When I'm sitting in my office, even though we're working, teaching remotely now, I keep news on all day. So if something's going on, I can turn and look at the screen. I can figure out what's going on. I'm reading 2 newspapers a day. And yes, I still read papers. And finding other sources for information. Watch C-SPAN. It may be dull, but you're going to get something good out of it. You go to a site like Government Executive, where they detail what's going on in here. You can recapture a lot of information and zero in on what you need. If you're paying attention, then the things that stand out or the things that should be the next step become more apparent. If you're starting from scratch every time you work on a story, you're just going to be overwhelmed, and it will be more difficult to produce it. And for those who have to do it on a faster deadline, say online or for broadcast purposes, I always told students that in print, we usually had the kind of deadlines where we could save you from yourself if you did something stupid. But if you did it on the air, millions of people know right away that you don't know what you're talking about.
Would you agree there, Jeff?
Yeah, I do agree, and I'll add that it does get easier. All of us have been in the business long enough. I've seen all at NABJ, where when you're just starting out, it's a lot. Sometimes it's a lot of information to process. Yeah, it can be a daunting task, but now after 20, 30 years in the business, and I'm sure Andrew and Jackie, those of us who are journalists would agree that you just get to a point where you can dig into your memory bank and think about past stories that can provide perspective on the current situation and where police and prosecutors might be going next as they look for leads. And that's the point that I'm at now, where and this is what CBS relies on me for, is the perspective that I've gained, having gained experience covering hurricanes, covering all sorts of homicide cases, all sorts of terrorism cases. All of that is stored up here. And so when something new happens, to fill some of the time on the air, you can dig into your memory bank and look at some past cases and find the links to what is going on now currently.
I think too, it helps if you have a source you can go to who can guide you through these things. When I first started covering courts, I talked to other journalists who had covered courts. I talked to lawyers I knew who would walk me through strategy. The first major murder case I ever had to cover, I was really struggling until I got sat down with a prosecutor who said, look, this is probably what he's going to do. And he mapped out a strategy and said, he's going to be looking for this. He's going to try to introduce this kind of evidence. And then once I understood the structure of the strategy that the lawyer would employ, and how he would, as a prosecutor, would anticipate what the defense would try to do, I could see whether that was coming together in the courtroom. And I could see, even if, and it turned out to be a case where the judge restricted the lawyers from talking to the media. So we could only go by what we saw going on in the courtroom, or working a few sources, which I did manage to do. So I was able to get some information, behind the scenes. I did the same thing with a banking case in New York years ago, where the late Percy Sutton and some other folks were accusing the feds of discriminatory practices when they were trying to rescue an ailing bank that was Black owned. And I had a friend who worked for the Fed, and I called her up and she said, I'm not going to talk to you for publication, but I'll explain to you the structure of how these kinds of cases go and what has to be done. So they've got to, present A, B, and C. You can't skip a step. You've got to know that. So once I understood what that was, and I was an editor at the time, I sent the reporter out and said, ask them if they did this, ask them if they did that. And once you get that, and those are the kinds of things that you learn to do to kind of help you better understand and pursue a story.
I would affirm what,
go ahead, Barbara.
I was just saying, I would really affirm what Jackie and Jeff are both saying. As someone on the other side of that equation, on the law enforcement side, I was always very happy to explain what was happening in a case. And it was always surprising to me how many journalists would call and say, I'm so sorry to bother you. I'm so sorry to use your time. Thank you so much for making time for me, which are all very nice and polite things to say. But I also have an interest in talking to you, right? Because a part of my job, one of the reasons we prosecute crimes is to deter others from engaging in similar conduct. So if you can help me get that story out there, as Jeff was saying, the FBI absolutely wants people to know that people are being prosecuted for showing up at the Capitol on January 6th, because they want to deter other people from doing it again. talk about these penalties, talk about people going to jail, getting prosecuted and arrested. And so you can help me if you tell the story. And I want you to tell it accurately. I don't want people to be speculating or getting facts wrong. And so if you want to ask me questions, I am very eager to help you with that. And I also understand it's very arcane. If someone watches a court hearing, it's very difficult for a very smart but person who is not familiar with the lingo to walk in there and know what's going on. And so I was always very happy to talk to reporters after a hearing, or if somebody called me to explain what had happened. I'm never going to be a source for a leak or a scoop, but I will explain all day. And I think many people in law enforcement feel similarly about that. And if you don't know where to begin, you can talk to the prosecutor who is in court, or most of the prosecutors' offices and most law enforcement agencies have public affairs officers, and it's their job to deal with the media. And so, talk to them, and they can also even connect you with people who are the officers, the relevant prosecutors in a case. So that's a good place to start.
And you and the people, I'm sorry, and Barbara, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, if you don't mind, Jeff.
Go ahead.
And Barbara, you and the people who work in your office, they know when to say no comment, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And frequently I would say no comment, but that was typically more like, are charges imminent? Are you going to file charges against so-and-so? There's a practice, at least at the Department of Justice, and I think most prosecutors follow, is that I can't comment on a pending investigation, and I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation, but I can talk to you about filed charges. And there's even an exception when necessary to assure the public that there is an investigation going on. So if everybody saw what happened on January 6th, there was a press conference to say, we are working on it, we are investigating, we will bring offenders to justice. That's okay too. And so, yes, it's I don't think it's the reporter's job to worry about when they can and can't comment. We've been trained in that, and we know when we can and can't comment. So there's no harm in asking the question.
And Jeff, the point of my follow-up with that question is, journalists should not feel afraid, or they should be bold to go ahead and ask those tough questions. Is that right?
That is, and that's why I was interrupting, and I'm so sorry that I did. But I'm eager to talk about this because I think it's so important. In 8 years as a network correspondent, I've never been rejected so much in my life. I've heard no so many times, and typically you would get some sort of complex. But it's part of my job to absorb these no's from prosecutors and law enforcement. You think the FBI agents want to talk? They don't want to talk, especially if they think that you're going to put their name on something. Now, if they think that they can trust you enough to give you information where you're not going to reveal where you're getting it from, that's the key. So if Barbara was saying to me, I can't comment on this, and I'd say, okay, well, let's go off the record. She'll say, well, I don't know. It'll be on background. I won't attribute it to you. And typically, if they trust me, and if they need to get the message out in some way, they'll say, okay, let's talk on background. Don't attribute it to me. So there are different ways to get information out of people. And a lot of times, as I said, they just think that you're going to put their name on it. And they feel freer to divulge information when they know that it'll be coming from a source rather than Barbara McQuade.
Mm-hmm. Would you concur, Jackie? Is that what you teach, or you encourage your educators, your professors to teach when it comes to asking those tough questions and developing a trust between you, the journalist, and the source?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the challenging thing these days is because of social media, getting them to cultivate the source in person, especially with law enforcement. Emailing or texting a law enforcement professional is not going to get you anywhere. I can see Jeff shaking his head, right? They want to know who are you, and how do I know I can trust you? And I tell the students, I say, and how do you know you can trust them? You get an email back. How do you know it's really from the person you think it's from? Mm-hmm. It might be somebody who just types up some answers and says, just give them the standard, whatever. So you've got to build that relationship, and you have to be able to have conversations with those sources when you don't need them. I think that's really key, that I may call you up. I'll ask you some questions. We'll talk. I'll say what's going on. I may not be doing a story that day. It may not lead to anything. But if we establish a relationship and you get to a point where, and I think everybody does this, where I give you a little bit of information and I'm gonna see what you do with it. And I may even say, well, you know, don't share this with anybody. But if I see it show up in a story, then I know I can't trust you. You know, so you've got to establish that you are trustworthy, that you follow the rules, that you know the steps, you know what is on the record, fully on the record, what's background, what's deep background, all the gradations, that you really understand that off the record is off the record. And we usually encourage reporters not to talk off the record if they can. And so, because you can't use any of it. You can't use it to get the information from somebody else. So if it's useless to you, you know, knowing it doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. So usually you have the conversation, and as they get more comfortable, they're going to be more comfortable giving it to you on background. And so you've got to make sure that you understand that and you cultivate the relationship. No one wants to feel used in the process, and they know you've got a job to do and you know they have a job to do. It's not designed for you all to become, you know, best buds, but they're also not your enemy. They're doing their job and you do yours.
Once again, everybody, we'll get to your questions in a moment. Once again, use the Q&A portion of Zoom here. Should be on the bottom right of your screen to go ahead and ask your question. We'll get to that in a second. Barbara, the National Counterterrorism Center, which is part of the US government, defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a group or individual based and operating entirely within the United States or Puerto Rico, blah, blah, blah. With the charges that we've seen so far, we haven't seen any terrorism charges with people that have been arrested so far. Why is that?
Well, I think yet is the key part of that statement. We may see them yet, but it is also the case that we don't have a purely a crime of domestic terrorism. There is a definition of domestic terrorism, but there's not a crime of domestic terrorism. And there's a good reason for that. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, we saw the FBI and the federal government targeting political groups like the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, Vietnam protesters, and calling them threats to national security and surveilling them and doing other things. And so that has always given us, I think, some discomfort with the idea of having domestic terrorism statutes on the books. And I think it's a worthy debate to have whether we want to do that. But because of our, you know, rights to free assembly and free speech and other things, we're a little bit uncomfortable with having that. There is a counterpart for international terrorism, which is crime of violence that's committed for a political purpose, essentially, very similar to the definition that you just read. That doesn't mean that we can't charge with some of these protesters with acts of violence. For example, there is a crime called seditious conspiracy, which makes it a crime to oppose by force the authority of the United States. I think it's quite possible we could see evidence of that. With regard to the people who planted bombs at the DNC and the RNC have not yet been apprehended, there is a crime for use of a weapon of mass destruction. And so it's not called terrorism, but it falls under the terrorism chapter of the federal code. So I think we could see that kind of conduct criminalized. But it's a problem, and I think it's worthy of further debate. Certainly the civil liberties concern are something we need to think about. But I think sometimes that by not charging people who are domestic terrorists with terrorism, we create this lack of equivalency. So if someone is acting on behalf of ISIS and engages in a mass shooting, we would charge that person with terrorism and we would call them a terrorist. If the same person engages in a mass shooting on behalf of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, we would just charge it as a mass shooting. It would not be charged as terrorism. And I think that's something to think about because there is a certain imprimatur of condemnation that comes with a terrorism charge. And if we're going to charge people who are acting on behalf of foreign terrorist organizations, you know, for the exact same conduct, might not we ought to also be charging people regardless of whether the cause is the Proud Boys or ISIS if they're engaged in the same kind of crime. But I think it's a matter worthy of further debate, but it's not an easy question because of the civil liberties implications and the shameful history of the past.
That debate that takes place, I mean, there is, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, is there an official list of foreign terrorism organizations?
There is, yep, there are about 64 groups on the list, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Hamas, all those groups that engage in international terrorism.
Is there such thing as an official list by the United States government of official domestic terrorism organizations? And
No.
if not, should one be created? And if one does get created, who has the authority to create it?
So there is not. Interestingly enough, Canada does have one. In fact, just designated the Proud Boys as a domestic terrorism group. I think the United States has always been reluctant to have such a list. You know, even the charge I was just discussing about having, crime of violence committed within the United States for a political purpose would be based on conduct, not based on affiliation. And I think because of our First Amendment right to freedom of assembly, which includes a freedom of association, we've always been a little reluctant. People can be a member of groups like the KKK or all, the neo-Nazis or whatever it is, as long as they don't engage in acts of violence. And that's where we've typically drawn that line. And so who would make such a list? I don't know. The Foreign Terrorist Organization is actually designated by the Secretary of State of the United States, and it's based on findings that the group engages in terrorism. And there is the ability for them to challenge their designation, but once they're designated, it becomes a crime to provide them with what's called material support, any goods, money, or services. And so to have a similar counterpart for domestic groups, no matter how repugnant, I think might fly in the face of our First Amendment.
Let me get to a question here from the audience from Jamila Bay. Thank you very much, Ms. Bay, for going ahead with this question. She writes, okay on the seditious assembly, but why is the language insurrection as opposed to failed coup? How has treason, even petite treason, not been called against this former administration? I think she means former presidential administration. He called those terrorists to prohibit the peaceful transfer of presidential power. What am I missing here?
I can take a stab at that one if you like.
Go ahead.
Great questions, because it certainly has the feel that those crimes have been committed when you look at the facts. But as I said earlier, prosecutors are really left with just the menu of options of statutes to choose from. So, if you go to Panera Bread, you can order the club sandwich, you can order the BLT, or you can order the tuna sandwich. You can't order the coup. It's not on the menu. You can only charge somebody with statutes that are on the books. So there is a statute for seditious conspiracy, which is this agreement by two or more persons to oppose by force the authority of the United States. I think that that is likely one that is being explored by federal prosecutors. In fact, the former acting U.S. attorney in D.C. said exactly that. There's another crime for inciting insurrection. And I think that is one that could very possibly be charged against President Trump. It was what he was charged with in the articles of impeachment and then acquitted for at the impeachment. Now, there are mixed reasons for that. Mitch McConnell said, I find him morally and ethically responsible for this. I just think that you have to have an impeachment trial while the person's still president. I think we'll leave that aside for the moment. But President Trump could be charged with this crime of inciting insurrection. Now, there is a potential First Amendment defense. I think it probably fails here, but there's a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court kind of laid out the dimensions of when free speech goes too far, where the line is drawn for inciting insurrection. And it is if you had an intent to incite violence, and if it was likely that that would be the effect. I think one could make a very strong argument that that standard is met here. Now, with regard to your question about treason, it feels treasonous when somebody does something that is disloyal to the United States. Which I think is probably where that question is coming from. Makes sense to me. But the statute, again, you're stuck with the statute that's on the books. The U.S. treason statute says treason is defined as giving aid and comfort to an enemy with whom we are at war, declared war by Congress. So during World War II, if we're at war with Germany and somebody gives aid and comfort to a German soldier, that would be treason, or shares secrets with the German government. That would be treason. So although one may argue that President Trump's conduct was disloyal to the United States, I don't think it fits that definition of treason.
Now, briefly, Barbara, I would like you to answer this question as briefly as possible because I want to get to another audience question. But following up from the two last answers you had, if midstream, the U.S. government did create a list, an official list of domestic terrorism organizations, and as you said, Canada says Proud Boys is a terrorist organization. If the U.S. followed up and actually did that, could people who are already arrested face additional charges?
No, that's an excellent question. There's a prohibition in our Constitution on what's called an ex post facto law. And so the law has to be on the books at the time you commit the offense, the conduct. And so we could change the law, but it would only apply to crimes occurring after the date it becomes effective.
Thank you. Jeff Winbush asks, why has the mainstream media been so timid to call the January 6th, been so timid to call the January 6th a white riot or an act of domestic terrorism by Trump supporters? Are they sacrificing accuracy out of fear they will be accused of straying into opining or editorializing? Jackie or Jeff, you want to go ahead with that one?
I'm gonna defer to Jeff on this one.
Oh, thanks.
I will say this as an observer within the past, let's say 3 to 4 years, really since Charlottesville, it's really been interesting hearing the phrase white nationalism or white nationalists or white supremacy or white supremacists mentioned more often in news coverage of other events. But how does that relate? How would you say that relates specifically to the events of January 6th?
Well, I think our thinking on these issues is evolving. In fact, I was out there on the West Capitol lawn watching people climb the walls. And frankly, I was first of all, I was blown away by what I was seeing. But then I kept calling them protesters. And looking back, I'm just thinking, you should have taken that step and called them a mob, attacker, insurrectionists, because that's exactly what they were. But, we were just in the moment and there was just so much going on. I was worried about tear gas and, people attacking me. So there were other things on my mind. But, I was proud of the news organization because, and most have followed suit, of course. We're calling it a mob. We're calling it an insurrection. We're calling it an attack. And I think that is an apropos description of what happened there. I mean, like many of you, I'm sure, I'm still blown away by those pictures, and I've seen them, thousands of times. But to see people beating on police officers with flagpoles and the American flag, to me, it's just, I will never forget what I saw. I will never cease to be amazed by it. And I think, when I write these scripts, and I wrote one today for tonight's evening news, I look for the worst description I can find without editorializing, because that's what this was. It was just, it still amazes me that it happened, but it's exactly what it was. It was a mob. It was an attack, and it was an insurrection.
I think that,
and that's, whether we call it a riot, I mean, it's, to me, those terms are good enough.
Yeah, I think too that it grew from one into the other, and so if we start getting into the true accuracy of words, right? They started out as protesters, and then they became, rioters. Well, they were more than rioters. A riot usually is something that springs from the moment. Folks are frustrated, they're tired, they've been insulted, something happens, but this was incited. And then they were emboldened, and then it just kind of took off on its own, and it really became mob mentality. And so trying to find the right words in the moment to report can be difficult. And I think that as people process it, what they want from the news media are reporters who will say what they're thinking. You're looking for somebody who agrees with you, who's going to say, daggone it, they weren't rioters, they weren't protesters, they were mobs, they were these other things. And so then they expect the nomenclature to change with the emotion that they're going through. And you've got to balance that, because we really do strive to be accurate. I believe that we have been beat up on as an industry so much in recent years that we really have to be careful about any seeming implicit bias. We think of how long it took reporters to describe the falsehoods that Trump put out as lies. We avoided using the word lie until finally somebody said, it is a lie. He's just lying. And then once you start saying it, then of course, it becomes more acceptable, or at least you feel more comfortable using it because it is the exact word. And we at the university, we're constantly telling our students to think about the words that they choose, to make sure that what they say is really what they mean, and that the word means what they want it to say. So there's sort of the whole time compression that makes it difficult to be precise. And this is journalism is the rough draft of history. We're doing it as it happens. And so we're not going to stop and say, now, is rioter the right word? Well, maybe they're really protesters. And looking at your watch and thinking, okay, I've got 2 minutes to air. I guess I better decide. That's not how it works. So you have to, as you process this, as you do the follow-up reports, then the language gets stronger and more precise, because you're able to sit down and go through everything and really assess what it is and call it what it is.
And Jackie, if you could give some real talk on this, another point here, not only when we're broadcasting or when we write something down, not only is it read or viewed or witnessed by thousands, if not millions of people that we care about, the impression that we give to them, we're also internally, we know that our bosses are also watching or reading. We know that our coworkers are also watching or reading. And realistically speaking, not everyone has the same political view outside of work. There may be people who actually may agree on many points from the previous presidential administration. So the choice of words when it comes to reporting and thinking about that additional stress, whether it's what your coworkers think or what your immediate manager or your general managers may think, that has an impact as well, as you may have actually heard from, because I know that you're also a mentor in addition to an educator. Can you talk about those sort of stresses or those sort of real world pressures that might be on a professional journalist?
Sure. You got to know the culture of the place you're in. You know what's acceptable. You know what the editorial stance is of your news organization. You know, based on where you are in the hierarchy, how much leeway you have. As a young reporter, when you start out, you may report a lot of things and say, well, this is how it is. And I was there, I saw it. And they will say, no, you can't say that. You're not a Jeff Pegues, you can't say that. Because he's got the longevity and the experience that when he uses those words, they trust that he knows what he's talking about. So you've got to work through all of that. You work through the politics of the moment. You have conversations with your editors, your immediate editors. Editors above are looking at what you're doing. They're coming in, they're looking at the piece, they're saying, I don't know if this really says what we wanted to say. And you often have a story organized by committee. And you got to know that that's just kind of part and parcel of the job, but you also have to know how to advocate for yourself and kind of where to draw the line. When is the point at which the decision is made and you got to live with it, and how much longer can you argue the point? But you have to make sure that even in the process of all of this, as emotional as it can be, that you're basing it on facts, that you're basing it on a logic. Because those are the things that are going to win the day in the end. And you also got to have people in the newsroom you can talk to, interact the same way you build sources, you build relationships in your newsroom for people who will support you when you have to fight these fights. Because nothing is worse than being the one who jumps out there and is leading the charge for a particular point of view or perspective on a story. And then when the editor turns and says, well, what do you think? And other people are like, I'm good. And it happens.
So Jamila has another question and sort of following up from that. Thank you very much, Jackie. Jeff, in your opinion, how do we better advocate then as journalists for ourselves when we actually hear a lie that is a lie when we view it, or we witness an act for what it actually is? How do we overcome that nervousness of whatever pressures are around and actually say something for what it is when it comes to actually telling the story?
I think that's what being a journalist is all about. That's why I got into this business. And I think as journalists, and even really as your average Joe, I think the last 4 years of the Trump presidency has pushed us all to the point where, you have to determine what is ethical, what is appropriate, what is legal, and what lines we won't cross. And, I like your question because I forget what story it was because there were so many instances during the Trump administration, but there was something he said that absolutely was racist. Absolutely. And we, as a news organization, we didn't just come out and say, well, that was racist. The Correspondent didn't do that. We had a discussion about it. And there were several managers, several correspondents, anchors involved. Should we go out and say what he said was racist? It wasn't, we didn't want to say, well, it could be perceived as racist. As an African-American male, my feeling was that was racist. He is racist. I don't care what you say. And we came out and actually said in the story, he made a racist remark. And it may have even gone further than that. But it was one of the moments when I was really, one of many moments, frankly, when I was proud of our news division for saying that, because there were other news organizations that didn't come out and say it. But it was racist, and there is no doubt it was racist. And frankly, he said several things over the years that were racist. And if anybody else had said them, we'd say, you're a racist. No doubt. No doubt. So, there are times when you have to stand up and you have to hold the line. And there were many instances during that administration where we had to hold the line, or else we lose credibility.
Wow. Let's see. We only have about 2 minutes left. On another practical side, Jeff and Jackie, if you don't mind, especially for the emerging journalists that are out there, if they come across a story or they hear about an arrest, they develop their sources and they pitch it and the pitch is successful, how do they hold on to the story? We have a very competitive business. Even in-house, how do you keep a story from being taken from you? Not only by another news organization, but even from within your own news organization?
That's a toughie, because I have seen lots of instances where reporters have pitched a story and an editor said, that's wonderful, come with me. And then they walk right over to another reporter and he says, tell him. And the reporter just has the story just taken straight from him, given to somebody else, not even allowed to work with the reporter or get a share a byline or a tagline or any of that kind of stuff. And so, again, it's the relationship building that you do in advance in the newsroom, that if something's going awry, you've got somebody who's going to back you up and say, no, this is Tony's story, this is Joe's story, and not let that happen, but it does. And the good guys in the newsrooms will say, I want to work with him on it, or I want to work with her on it. And then that way it doesn't get totally snatched, because who wants to be Bigfoot in the newsroom? We know who they are. We know who tries to take your stories, and it should not happen, but it does, especially to younger reporters, or someone puts their name on a story when there's a number of people on a story, giving, and then there's one byline, and then everybody else is in a credit box, or you find, I would tell young reporters, when you call in to see if there are questions on your story, make sure you say, are there questions on my part of the story? So that the editor knows what section was yours, so that you can get credit for it, because otherwise somebody will take the whole thing and just make it seem like your contribution was minimal.
Jeff, would you concur with all that?
Yeah, Andrew, I was wondering if you've been talking to my bosses or something, because, I mean, you know, network television is it's a very competitive space. And I think every network is the same way. It's competitive. People want the big story. And, you know, in the past, I'd just be like, okay, well, that's fine. But now, you know, I've learned that you got to fight for what you think you earned. You have to fight. If you have a story that you broke, you got to, you know, stay on top of it. And when they try to give it to somebody else, fight for it. You have to. And that's something, you know, even as I said, I've been in the business for 30 years, but I didn't figure that out until like last week, I think. You know, you really have to fight for it. But it's, you know, it's not unlike being on Wall Street or being a U.S. attorney. You know, they fight over cases all the time, I'm sure. You know, so you got to protect your turf. And if you think you can do a better job covering a story, you got to go for it.
My dad always said, don't give them a stick to beat you with. So you stay on, and just stay on top of your story. Don't let somebody find the nugget, the in that allows them to kind of weasel in on your story, and then they can take it from you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Barbara, I've seen you giggling over there. I think you got a kick out of us talking shop here a little bit. It sounds like familiar territory in your realm as well.
You know, I think human nature, right? We all have pride in our work, and everybody's competitive, and sometimes that can be a good thing, right? If it causes people to work harder to get stories or build cases or whatever it is. So as long as it's channeled in healthy and productive ways.
Well, the three of you, thank you very much for working so hard and participating with all of us this evening. Once again, everyone, this has been the NABJ webinar, the U.S. Capitol Insurrection and Journalism. Basically, where do we go from here? Brought to you by the National Association of Black Journalists. Thank you very much to the NABJ webinar team for helping organize this and helping to keep us all in line with scheduling and everything that's been transpiring thus far. Thank you very much to our panelists. Jacqueline Jones, Jackie Jones from Morgan State University, Barbara McQuade, University of Michigan, former U.S. Attorney, Eastern District of Michigan, and Jeff Pegues from CBS News. Once again, everyone, I'm Andrew Humphrey, meteorologist and reporter, WDIV in Detroit, also lifetime NABJ member. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. Pray and hope that you stay well, stay safe, and stay healthy. Thank you again to our panelists, NABJ, and all of you out there for listening and watching. Have a great Wednesday evening.